This is Chapter 6, which is on conformity and obedience. So first, let's define conformity. Conformity is simply a change in behavior or your beliefs to accord or to get along with others. There are two types of conformity. The first is acceptance. In other words, you genuinely believe in what the group has persuaded you to do. You sincerely believe that the group's actions are right. In other words, you have accepted their beliefs, and so you conform to those beliefs. For example, you get your flu shot because you genuinely believe it will protect your health. That's acceptance. The other type of conformity is compliance, which is conforming to an expectation or request without fully believing in what you're doing. Often we do that to reap a reward or avoid a punishment. For example, you're pressured to drink alcohol by a group of friends even though you don't really want to. You fall to the pressure because you don't want them to make fun of you. In a sense, you're avoiding punishment of being made fun of. So let's look at obedience. Obedience is a type of compliance, which we just discussed, doing something you wouldn't do otherwise because someone else says you need to or because rules or laws require it. Often it's because an authority tells you to do it. For example, a child's mom tells them to clean their room. Obviously, mom is an authority, so if she says, clean your room, you're going to be obedient. And you can see from the diagram on the right that overall there's conformity. The types, as we just discussed, are acceptance and compliance. And obedience is a certain type of compliance, that is obeying authority. Let's look at norm formation. First, let's define a norm. It's a pattern or trait taken to be typical in the behavior of a social group. What is norm formation? The process through which shared expectations, values, and rules develop within a group or organization. So it's a pattern, it's a trait that tends to be accepted by the group. What does the research on norm formation tell us? It reveals the power of suggestibility, that we're easily influenced by the group when they suggest that we have a certain belief or exhibit a certain behavior, and that people tend to follow the group norm. If we're in a group, we tend to follow their beliefs and behavior. Let's take another look at obedience now, which, if you remember, is a form of compliance. An experiment that your book discusses and that teaches us a lot about obedience is the Milgram shock experiment. There's a summary on the left. He created an experiment to see if participants would follow orders, if they would be obedient, even when the requested behavior went against their beliefs. Simple explanation of the experiment: a researcher asked the participant to administer electric shocks to a test subject when he answers questions incorrectly. The test subject is an actor who makes noises of pain when he receives the shocks. Obviously, he isn't really receiving the shocks, because that would certainly be unethical. And the participant is made to believe that each shock is stronger than the last one. And you can see the little diagram on the left that kind of shows that the experimenter and the subject administering the shocks are in the same room. And the actor is in another room, so they can't see each other. Side note, it's worth noting that Milgram's experiment would likely no longer be considered ethical, primarily due to the undue stress and pressure put on the subject. So this experiment could not be performed today, but it still teaches us a lot about obedience. So what did Milgram conclude? He concluded that ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of killing an innocent human being. Obedience to authority is ingrained in all of us from the way we are brought up. For example, we are brought up to obey parents, teachers, doctors, anyone in authority, policemen, we're taught to obey them. But as you'll see in your textbook, I didn't want to get into this in the slides, but there are some questions about these findings, whether they're exactly accurate or not. So let's continue to look at Milgram. What else did he teach us besides what we just mentioned? He taught us that he believed 4 factors determine how obedient we are. The first is the victim's distance. Known and seen victims are more difficult to hurt than unknown and unseen victims. In his experiment, you'll note that, as I mentioned, there was a wall between the subject and the one being shocked. So if he could see the victim being shocked, it would probably have been more difficult for him to conform or be obedient. The closeness and legitimacy of the authority. When the one making the command is physically close, compliance increases. However, the authority must be perceived as legitimate. So if you remember the diagram again, the researcher who was telling the subject to shock was in the same room and he was very close. So compliance increases when that's the case. Institutional authority, authorities backed by institutions wield social power. For example, the experimenter could have been at a university, a well-known university that does research. He's going to have even more social power if he's backed by an institution like that. Finally, he taught us about the liberating effects of group influence. Another type of experiment that Milgram did was he placed 2 accomplices with the subject. So now there's 3 people in the room. The accomplices defied the experimenter. The majority of subjects conformed to the accomplices. So that tells us if there's a group, it's easier to defy the experimenter. It's easier to say, well, I'm not going to shock the person when you're with a group. Milgram also teaches us more about behavior and attitudes. Remember in chapter 4, we talked about behavior and attitudes. He taught us that when external influences override internal convictions, attitudes fail to determine behavior. So when there's an external influence, especially of an authority, we might go against our internal convictions and beliefs. Our beliefs no longer determine our behavior. So we just took another look at obedience through Milgram's experiment. Let's take another look at conformity. What predicts conformity? Group size. 3 to 5 people will elicit much more conformity than just 1 or 2. So if we're in a group of 3 to 5 people, kind of like it showed in Milgram's experience, we're going to be much more likely to conform to the group than when we're by ourselves. Unanimity, people will usually voice their own convictions if just one other person has also differed from the majority. That's similar to group size. If there's at least one other person who agrees with your beliefs and exhibits defiance to authority, it's easier for us to also exhibit that defiance. Cohesion, a group of your closest friends would influence you more than a group of acquaintances. That's kind of common sense that we are most influenced by our closest friends. We're most likely to have their beliefs and conform if they do. Status, higher status people tend to have more impact. Again, that's the power of authority in a sense. A doctor is telling me to get a flu shot is more likely to make me conform than just an acquaintance telling me to get a flu shot because he or she has authority. Public response, people conform more when they must respond in front of others rather than writing their answers privately. That's also kind of common sense. If I'm in front of a crowd, I'm going to be more likely to conform to what that crowd is doing than if I can just write my answer down privately. Prior commitment. Making a public commitment makes people hesitant to back down. If I've told multiple people my beliefs, I'm going to be more hesitant to back down from those beliefs. So why do people conform? There are 2 types of influences. Normative influence, simply our desire to be liked, and informational influence, simply our desire to be right. And there's a further description of normative and informational influence on the side. Again, normative influence is simply you want other people to like you. Sometimes you change your actions to match the group, even though you don't agree, but simply because you want them to like you. Informational influence, sometimes you go along with the group because you think they know more than you do, and you change your own beliefs or attitudes because you think that the group is right. Are some people more likely to conform? Researchers have found that this is true, that some people are more likely to conform, and it's based on the following three predictors. Based on the person's personality, people with a personality that's higher in agreeableness and conscientiousness are more likely to conform, and people high in an openness to experience are less likely to conform. Our culture determines whether we're more likely to conform. Collectivistic countries and cultures, people are more likely to conform because they're more interested in what the group thinks. Social roles, most people play the part that is most accepted by society. They follow the norm, which we discussed norms earlier as just being beliefs that are commonly held by this society. And most of us want to be accepted by society, so we follow those norms. That's it for chapter 6. Thank you, and let me know if you have any questions.